Stuart Strange returned from the battlefield, but he didn't truly come home. He was a ghost in his own house, haunted by memories that only Apollo, his loyal gray and white German shepherd, could reach. While Stuart fought his internal war, his son Mike was desperate to escape the suffocating silence. The boy decided to build a kingdom of his own in the woods, a fortress in a tree. But this fortress didn't bring peace. It attracted new enemies. The children's war quickly escalated, and Apollo realizes something terrible. Mike is starting to act just like the very soldier his father is trying to bury. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The heat of the 1972 Georgia summer settled over Red Clay Creek like a damp, heavy blanket. It was an oppressive physical weight that silenced the birds by midday and left the air thick with the smell of hot pine needles and red dust. The only sound that seemed to thrive in the humidity was the constant high-pitched whine of cicadas, a relentless noise that drilled into the mind. On the front porch of a small white clapboard house, Stuart Strange sat on the top step, staring at nothing. He had been home for 3 weeks, but in truth, he had not yet arrived. Stuart was a tall man, but the war had hollowed him out, leaving his frame thin and angular inside his simple cotton shirt and worn denim trousers. His brown hair was cut short, military neat, but it was his eyes that held the truth. They were a flat, distant blue, seeing something far beyond the dusty yard and the drooping sunflowers by the fence. He held an unlit cigarette in his hand, had been holding it for an hour, his thumb rubbing small circles on the paper. A bead of sweat traced a path from his temple down his jaw, but he did not wipe it away. He did not move at all. At his feet, pressed tightly against his leg, lay the only living creature that seemed to have permission to enter Stuart's silence. Apollo was a 4-year-old German shepherd, large for his breed, with a magnificent coat of shifting gray and white that made him look almost ghostly against the dark floorboards of the porch. His temperament was preternaturally calm, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. He had been Stuart's companion long before Vietnam, but the bond forged in the crucible of that shared experience was now something deeper, something primal and unspoken. Apollo lay in the shade, panting softly in the heat, but he was not relaxed. His body was tense, attuned entirely to the man beside him. From the main road, half a mile away, a sharp sound echoed through the heavy air. It was the loud report of a truck backfiring, a common noise in the rural county. To Stuart, it was the sharp crack of a rifle shot. He did not jump. He did not cry out. He simply stopped breathing. His body went rigid, his knuckles turning white as his hand crushed the cigarette. His gaze locked on the tree line, his mind instantly transported 8,000 miles away to a jungle canopy. Before the tension had even fully seized Stuart, Apollo was on his feet. The dog made no sound. He simply pushed his heavy head firmly under Stuart's rigid hand, nudging it until the man's fingers were forced to unclench. Apollo then rested his chin on Stuart's knee, whining softly, a low, anxious vibration deep in his chest. He did not look at the road. He looked only at Stuart's face. Slowly, agonizingly, the man's lungs released their breath in a shuddering sigh. The focus returned to his eyes, shifting from the distant jungle to the dog's concerned gaze. Stuart's hand, still shaking, buried itself in the thick fur of Apollo's ruff. "It's all right, boy," he whispered. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "I'm here." Apollo licked his hand, acknowledging the lie, but accepting the words. He did not move from his post. Inside the stifling kitchen, Patricia Strange watched the scene through the screen window, her hands submerged in lukewarm dishwater. She was a woman in her early 30s, with practical brown hair tied back from a face that was still lovely, but etched with a new, profound exhaustion around her eyes. She wore a simple yellow sundress, faded from too many washes. She was strong, the kind of woman who managed the books, fixed the leaky faucet, and mowed the lawn. But she was standing on the very edge of her endurance. She had prayed for Stuart's return for 2 long years. Now he was home, a silent ghost in his own house, and she was terrified. She felt a desperate, selfish ache for the man who had left, the man who laughed and held her. This silent, haunted man was a stranger, and she did not know how to reach him. She was grieving a husband who was sitting 10 feet away. Forcing the tightness from her throat, Patricia dried her hands on a towel. She had to hide her fear, especially from the children. The children were hiding too. In the small living room, 11-year-old Mike Strange lay on his stomach, flipping through a comic book he had already read 3 times. He was a small, wiry boy, vibrating with a nervous energy that had nowhere to go. He hated the heat, but mostly he hated the silence. Before his father came home, the house was full of music and shouting. Now, every small noise felt like a transgression. "Stop jiggling your leg," Diana, his 13-year-old sister, whispered from the armchair. Diana was perched by the window, pretending to read a book. She had her mother's observant eyes and a worried set to her mouth that was too old for her face. She was the buffer, the watcher. She watched her mother watch her father, and she watched her brother trying not to explode. "I'm bored," Mike whispered back, his voice angry. "There's nothing to do. We can't even play the radio." "Dad's resting," Diana said, repeating the family's new, fragile mantra. "He's always resting," Mike snapped, slamming the comic book shut. The noise was too loud in the quiet room. Both children froze, glancing toward the front porch. Outside, Stuart did not react, but they saw Apollo's head lift, his ears twitching toward the sound. Mike felt a hot rush of shame, quickly followed by a surge of frustration. It wasn't fair. He felt trapped in his own home, suffocated by the heat and the quiet, heavy sadness that had followed his father back from the war. He scrambled up and went to the back window, looking past their small patchy yard toward the woods that bordered their property. Just inside the tree line stood a massive, ancient oak tree, its branches spreading wide like welcoming arms. Mike stared at it, an idea forming in his mind. A place to escape. "What are you looking at?" Diana asked, joining him. "That oak tree," Mike said, his voice changing, losing its anger and filling with a new, sudden purpose. "We should build a house up there." Diana looked skeptical. "A treehouse? In this heat? Mom will say it's dangerous." "Not a treehouse," Mike insisted, his eyes bright. "A fortress. A real one, with walls and a roof. A place that's ours. We could keep stuff there. No one could bother us." Diana looked from her brother's eager face back toward the front porch, where her father sat lost in his invisible war, guarded by his loyal dog. She looked toward the kitchen, where she could hear her mother quietly washing the same dishes over again. The house felt like a tightly wound spring. And Mike was right. They needed a place to breathe. She nodded slowly. "A fortress," she agreed. "Okay, let's do it." The work began the next morning, under a sky that was already a pale, washed-out blue by 8 o'clock. The heat was relentless, climbing steadily, turning the air into a shimmering soup. Mike, however, was a boy possessed by a new and desperate purpose. He dragged plywood scraps from the sagging shed behind the house. He found a rusty coffee can full of mismatched nails and an old hammer with a chipped handle. Diana, ever the practical one, filled 2 glass jars with water, her face already flushed. "Mike, we're going to melt before we even start." "We won't," Mike said, his voice tight with determination. He squinted up at the massive oak. "We need a ladder first, a strong one." Apollo followed them, his gray and white coat already looking too warm. He panted in the shade of the great tree, his tongue lolling, but his eyes were alert, tracking the children's movements. He was on duty, a silent, 4-legged guardian. For 2 hours they worked. Diana, surprisingly strong, helped Mike lean 2 long salvage 2x4s against the thick trunk. The plan was to nail short pieces of wood across them to act as rungs. It was here that Mike's vision met the reality of his 11-year-old body. The wood was heavy, the hammer was awkward, and the large nails were thick. He balanced precariously on a crate, trying to hold a cross rung in place with his left hand while hammering with his right. The heat was making his palms sweat. The cicadas in the surrounding pines screamed, a sound like a frayed nerve. He swung the hammer. The sharp thwack echoed, but the nail only sank in 1/4 of an inch, bent sideways with a protesting screech of metal on wood. "You missed," Diana said, holding the bottom of the ladder steady. "I know I missed," Mike snapped. He yanked the nail out, his face crimson with more than just the heat. He set another nail. He swung again, harder this time. The hammerhead struck the nail off-center, glanced off, and the dull, heavy thud of the metal striking his own thumb was followed by a sharp intake of breath. Mike cried out, a sound of pure frustration. He dropped the hammer, which fell to the dirt with a soft thud. He shoved the ladder rung, sending it clattering to the ground. "I can't do it! It's stupid! This whole thing is stupid!" He kicked the coffee can, sending nails scattering across the red clay. He looked exactly like his father, his small body radiating a familiar, helpless anger. From the front porch, Stuart Strange watched. He had been sitting there since sunrise, nursing a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk. He watched his children venture into the woods. He saw his son, his bright, energetic boy, filled with this sudden, sour rage. He recognized it instantly. It was the same corrosive frustration that lived in his own chest. The anger that came when the world simply refused to obey, when his own hands refused to work. He saw Mike ball his fists, saw his shoulders hunch, and Stuart's first instinct was to look away, to retreat inside to the cool dark of his bedroom. He did not know how to fix this. He did not know how to talk to his son anymore. But Apollo did. The dog who had been watching Mike's outburst with a low, anxious whine rumbling in his chest got to his feet. He walked over to the fuming boy, not with haste, but with calm purpose. Mike stood stiffly, tears of anger stinging his eyes, refusing to look at his sister. He felt a gentle, wet pressure against his clenched fist. He looked down. Apollo was nudging his hand, the one he had just struck with the hammer. The dog whined again, softly, and pushed his broad head against Mike's chest, leaning his weight into him. It was a simple, grounding pressure. It was not a demand, but an offering. Mike's rigid posture broke. The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, replaced by the crushing weight of his frustration. He buried his face in the dog's thick gray fur. "It won't work, Apollo," he mumbled into the dog's neck. "I can't even nail it straight." Apollo simply stood there, a solid, warm presence, absorbing the boy's disappointment. After a moment, he licked Mike's ear. Mike let out a shaky laugh and scrubbed the spot. He took a deep breath, the smell of pine and dog filling his lungs. and the tension finally eased. Okay, I'll try again," he said, pulling away. He looked at Diana. Maybe you hold the nail this time." On the porch, Stuart watched the entire exchange. His heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. He saw his son, on the verge of the same dark collapse he felt every day, brought back by the simple, uncomplicated affection of a dog. He realized with a profound and painful clarity that Apollo was succeeding where he was failing. The dog was connecting. The dog was healing. Stuart was just there, a ghost haunting his own family. He closed his eyes. The image of his son and his dog burned into his mind, and he felt a cold shame that had nothing to do with the war. By late afternoon, the ladder was finished. It was ugly, and the rungs were crooked, but it was strong. They hauled up the first platform boards, and the fortress began to take shape. It was a chaotic assembly of mismatched wood, a floor sitting awkwardly in the V of two massive branches. Diana, wiping sweat and red dust from her forehead, stepped back to look at their progress. Mike was beaming, his earlier frustration forgotten. "It's perfect," Mike breathed. Diana bit her lip. She too had been watching their father on the porch. She had seen the way he stared at the woods, the way he flinched at loud noises. She looked at the heavy boards Mike had insisted on using, the low, slit-like gaps he was leaving between them for lookout posts. "Mike," she said softly, her voice heavy with a worry she couldn't quite name, "it looks more like a bunker than a treehouse." Mike's smile only widened. "Exactly. It's got to be strong. It's a fortress, remember? To keep people out." As if summoned by his words, a new sound cut through the drone of the cicadas, the snap of a twig, coming from deeper in the pines. Apollo, who had been dozing, was on his feet in an instant, a low vibration in his chest. Two boys emerged from the dense shadows of the woods. The one in the lead was tall for his age, perhaps 14 or 15, with a wiry, sun-baked strength. He wore cut-off shorts and no shirt, his skin coated in a sheen of sweat and grime. His hair was a shaggy, dirty blonde, and his eyes were a pale, cold blue. This was Dave Wilson, the eldest of the Wilson brothers, a family known for living rough on the other side of the county. Behind him, like a pale shadow, was his younger brother, Pete. Pete was perhaps 9 or 10, thin and pale, with a chronic sniffle. He mimicked his older brother's aggressive stance, but his eyes were nervous. Dave Wilson stopped at the edge of the clearing, his gaze taking in the ladder, the platform, and the two children. His eyes lingered on the hammer. "Well, look-a-here, Pete," Dave said, his voice a lazy, confident drawl. "Some kids building a pile of junk." Mike, startled, instinctively moved in front of Diana. "Who are you?" "This is our woods, stupid," Dave said, ignoring the question. He pointed a dirt-caked finger at the oak tree. "That's our tree. We hunt squirrels here. You're scaring them off." "We live right there," Mike protested, pointing toward his house, barely visible through the trees. "Don't care," Dave said. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "That's a nice dog." Apollo did not move, but the low growl in his chest became audible, a serious, warning sound. Dave smirked, a look of mean calculation. "You better watch that dog," he said, his voice dropping. "We don't like trespassers. And we don't like thieves building on our land." He spat a thick wad of tobacco juice onto the red clay, just feet from where Diana was standing. "Come on, Pete." Without another word, the two brothers turned and vanished back into the pine shadows as silently as they had appeared, leaving a cold dread hanging in the hot, heavy air. The threat from Dave Wilson hung in the hot, sticky air for 3 days. It was a tangible presence, settling over the strange household just as the humidity did. Mike was defiant. He woke up each morning with a nervous energy, eager to get back to the woods, to prove he wasn't scared. Diana was hesitant. She found excuses to stay inside, offering to help her mother shell peas or sweep the porch, casting anxious glances toward the tree line. "You can't let him win," Mike argued at breakfast, pushing his oatmeal around the bowl. "If we stop building, he wins." Patricia, standing at the sink, overheard them. Her back stiffened. She was already worried about Stuart, who had barely slept, his nights punctuated by muffled sounds from the bedroom. Now she had to worry about her children being threatened by the county's most notorious troublemakers. "Maybe you should play in the yard today, Mike," she said, her voice strained. "No," Mike said, his voice quiet but stubborn. "It's our tree." Patricia closed her eyes. She wanted to forbid it, to lock them inside, but she looked at Mike's tense face, so much like his father's, and she knew it was useless. He needed this. "Take Apollo," she said, her voice firm. It wasn't a request. "He stays with you. Do not let him out of your sight. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Mike said, his spirits lifting instantly. Stuart, sitting on the porch, watched his 2 children and his dog walk toward the woods. He hadn't said a word, but his gaze followed Apollo. He watched the dog's steady, confident gait, the way his ears swiveled, constantly scanning. Stuart's hands gripped the arms of his rocking chair. He was sending his children into the woods with the only soldier he had left. The work on the fortress resumed, but the atmosphere was gone. The joy of creation had been replaced by the tense, hurried labor of defense. "Hand me that board," Mike ordered from the platform. "The thick one. We need to cover this gap." Diana, acting as lookout, passed it up. "Mike, this is too high. If we fall—" "We won't fall. We have to make the walls higher, so they can't see in." Diana sighed and looked around. The woods felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. Every snap of a twig made her jump. Apollo, however, was not jumpy. He was alert. He did not rest in the shade as he had before. He patrolled the small clearing, making a slow, deliberate circle, sniffing the air, his body a picture of calm readiness. "He knows," Diana whispered, watching the dog. "Good," Mike said, hammering a nail with 3 loud, defiant thwacks. "Let 'em come." They came an hour later. There was no warning. One moment, the clearing was empty. The next, Dave and Pete Wilson were standing at the edge of the trees, as if they had materialized from the heat itself. Dave had a mean, knowing smirk on his face. Pete, behind him, looked nervous but excited. "Well, well," Dave drawled, hooking his thumbs into the pockets of his dirty jeans. "Look at the little carpenters. Building a fort?" Apollo stopped patrolling. He stood near the base of the ladder, his head raised, watching Dave. He didn't growl, not yet. "Go away, Dave," Mike called down from the platform. His voice tried to be brave, but it came out a little too high. "I don't think I will," Dave said. He sauntered into the clearing, his eyes scanning their work. "This is a real piece of junk. My dog lives in a better house than this." "It's not for you," Diana said, her voice trembling. "That's right, it ain't," Dave said. He stopped at the base of the ladder. He looked up at Mike, then down at the crooked rungs. "This is our tree. We told you." "You don't own the trees," Mike countered. "Sure we do," Dave said. He reached out and kicked the base of the ladder. The rattling sound of wood on bark echoed in the clearing. "See? Ours." "Stop it!" Mike yelled. He scrambled down the ladder, his face red with rage. He was small, but he was fast, and he landed on the ground in front of Dave, his fists balled. "Don't you touch it!" This was exactly what Dave wanted. His smirk widened. Pete giggled nervously from the tree line. "Or what, little man?" Dave taunted. "You gonna hit me?" Mike was trembling, caught between his rage and the obvious fact that Dave was 2 years older and a foot taller. Just get out of here." Dave looked at Mike, then at Diana, who was still on the platform, frozen in fear. He looked at Apollo, who was watching him intently. Dave decided to end this. "Pathetic," Dave spat. And with a sudden, brutal motion, he shoved Mike with both hands. It wasn't just a push. It was a violent, contemptuous shove designed to humiliate. Mike, caught off guard, had no balance. He stumbled backward, his feet tangling. The ground near the base of the tree, shaded and damp, had turned the red clay into a slick, sticky mire. Mike's feet slipped out from under him, and he went down, landing hard on his back in the middle of the mud puddle. A thick, red-brown ooze splattered his face and chest. For a second there was silence. Dave laughed, a short, ugly bark. Pete joined in. The laughter was cut short by a new sound. It was not a bark, it was not a yelp. It was a deep, guttural sound that seemed to rumble up from the very earth. Apollo moved. He didn't charge. He didn't run. He exploded across the 10 feet separating him from the Wilsons. It was 3 bounds, a blur of gray and white fur. He didn't attack Dave. He did exactly as the summary said. He put himself directly between the attacker and his charge. He stood over Mike's fallen body, his legs splayed, his head low. The hackles on his back, from his neck to the base of his tail, rose in a thick, menacing ridge. Then he let them see his teeth. His upper lip curled back, exposing long white canines, and the growl intensified. It was a low, terrifying vibration that promised violence. This was not a pet. This was a guardian, a creature of pure protective instinct. Dave Wilson froze. The smirk was gone, replaced by a sudden, pale shock. He was a bully, used to intimidating other children. He was not prepared for this. He was staring at 90 pounds of serious German shepherd, and the dog was not bluffing. Pete, seeing the dog's teeth, let out a small whimper and took 2 steps back. "Apollo!" Mike gasped, wiping mud from his eyes. The dog did not look at him. His eyes, cold and focused, were locked on Dave. Call off your dog," Dave stammered, his bravado evaporating. Mike, still sitting in the mud, suddenly realized what was happening. He wasn't scared anymore. He was powerful. He had the power. "He's not moving," Mike said, his voice hard. "Not until you leave." "I ain't scared of your mutt," Dave tried, but his voice cracked. Apollo took one slow, deliberate step forward, and the growl deepened. It was the only answer he needed to give. That was enough. Dave turned, grabbing his younger brother's arm. "Come on, Pete, we're leaving. This ain't over," Dave yelled from the safety of the trees. "Your stupid dog has to sleep sometime." They crashed through the undergrowth, the sounds of their retreat fading quickly, leaving only the sound of the cicadas and Diana's sharp, shaky breathing. The clearing was silent for a long moment. Apollo held his position, scanning the woods where the Wilsons had disappeared. Only when he was satisfied the threat was gone did he relax. The hackles lowered, the growl subsided. He turned back to Mike. He nudged the boy's muddy shoulder, his demeanor instantly changing from protector back to companion. He licked the clay from Mike's cheek, whining softly. Mike started to laugh. It was a wild, hysterical sound. Did you see his face die? Did you see him run? He scrambled to his feet, covered head to toe in red mud, beaming. Apollo saved us. He's a hero. We won. He threw his muddy arms around the dog's neck. But Diana didn't celebrate. She slowly climbed down the ladder, her face pale as chalk. She was shaking. "Diana? What's wrong?" Mike asked, his triumphant grin fading. Diana leaned against the tree, her knuckles white. She hadn't seen a victory. She had seen fangs. She had seen the pure, lethal intent in Apollo's eyes. It was the same terrifying, violent energy she sometimes felt radiating from her father in the dark. "He could have," she whispered, her voice tight with horror. "Mike, he could have really hurt him. He could have torn him apart." Mike looked from his sister's terrified face to the loyal dog who was now placidly licking mud off his own nose. Mike had seen a protector. Diana had seen a killer. And the red clay line between them had just been drawn. July arrived, and the heat that had been a heavy blanket now became a suffocating wet wool. The air in Red Clay Creek grew heavier by the day, thickening with humidity until the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. For a week, the tension built. It was in the air, heavy and electric, waiting to break. The tension was in the Strange house, too. Mike was energized, emboldened by his victory against the Wilsons. He and his small group of friends, 2 brothers from down the road, had turned the fortress into a hive of activity, hauling up ammunition in the form of pine cones and stockpiling buckets of red mud. Diana, however, stayed away. She remained inside the house, her books untouched, watching the world through the screen windows. She was quiet, her gaze often falling on Apollo. She still fed him, still stroked his head when he nudged her hand, but a new wariness had entered her touch. She had seen what he was capable of, and it frightened her. It was a violent shadow that she now saw everywhere, especially in the silence of her father. Patricia felt the pressure from all sides, the looming threat of the Wilsons, her daughter's sudden retreat, her son's aggressive new game, and Stuart. Stuart was the epicenter. He had grown quieter, the invisible wall around him higher and thicker than ever. He spent his days on the porch, rocking, his eyes on the yellowish horizon. On a Tuesday afternoon, the air finally stopped moving. The cicadas went silent. The birds vanished. A profound, unnatural stillness fell over the county. "It's coming," Patricia said, walking through the house, her movements quick and jerky. She began closing windows, the metallic scrape of the sashes sounding unnaturally loud. "Mike! Diana, get inside! Now!" Mike scrambled down from the treehouse, annoyed at the interruption. Diana was already in the living room watching her father. Stuart was standing at the edge of the porch, perfectly still, his back to the house. He was staring at the sky, which was now a sickly churning green. Then it came. There was no preliminary rumble. The sky was torn open by a single blinding flash of white light, followed instantly by a sound so violent it shook the house on its foundations. It was not a boom. It was a deafening, echoing crack, the sound of the sky splitting apart. Patricia cried out and dropped a window. Mike flinched, his hands flying to his ears. Stuart was gone. He didn't walk. He didn't run. He reacted. In the split second between the flash and the sound, his body had reverted to pure, visceral instinct. He launched himself off the porch, stumbling as he hit the yard, and sprinted, low and fast, not toward the house, but toward the shed. "Stuart!" Patricia screamed, running to the front door. He didn't hear her. He reached the flimsy wooden door of the shed, tore it open, and plunged inside, pulling it shut behind him. The dull thud of the door closing was immediately swallowed by the next explosion of thunder. "Dad!" Mike yelled, his bravado gone, replaced by a child's terror. "What's wrong with Dad?" "Stay inside, Mike! Lock the screen!" Patricia yelled over her shoulder. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it. She fumbled for it, her heart pounding against her ribs. And then the rain began. It was not a drizzle. It was a deluge, a solid wall of water that hit the tin roof of the house with a noise like 1,000 drums, a deafening, rattling roar. Inside the house, Apollo was frantic. The dog had been in the living room with Diana. At the first crack of thunder, he had sprung to his feet. When Stuart ran, Apollo ran, barking, a sharp, panicked sound. He slammed his body against the locked screen door just as Patricia was ordering it shut. "No, Apollo, stay!" Diana yelled, grabbing his collar. The dog, usually so calm, thrashed in her grip. He didn't growl at her, but he pulled with his entire 90-pound weight, his eyes wild, fixed on the shed. He knew. He understood the sound of the sky. He knew where his man had gone. "He has to go!" Patricia shouted, finally getting the flashlight. "Let him go, Diana! Open the door!" Diana, her own fear momentarily forgotten, fumbled with the latch. Apollo didn't wait. He burst through the screen, his paws finding purchase in the instantly soaked red clay, and disappeared into the gray sheet of rain. Inside the shed, it was pitch black. The air was thick with the smell of rust, damp earth, and old fertilizer. The roar of the rain on the tin roof was deafening, a constant, sharp rattling, like endless machine gun fire. Stuart Strange was wedged in the farthest, darkest corner, behind a stack of empty feed sacks and a broken tiller. He was coiled into a tight fetal position, his hands laced over the back of his neck, his body shaking uncontrollably. He was not in Georgia. He was in the jungle, pinned down, the monsoon unleashing hell, the air alive with the sharp cracks of mortar fire. He was muttering, the same words over and over, a desperate, broken prayer. Get down, stay down." The shed door, already battered by the wind, slammed open, crashing against the interior wall. Stuart screamed, a raw, terrified sound. "Incoming!" A dark shape burst through the opening. It was low, wet, and fast. Apollo. The dog scrambled through the dark, his claws scraping on the wooden floor, guided by the sound of Stuart's voice. He found him in the corner. Stuart, blinded by panic, lashed out, his elbow connecting with the dog's side. "Get off me! Get down!" Apollo absorbed the blow, whining, and did not retreat. He pushed forward, forcing his way past the feed sacks. He did exactly what he had been trained, or perhaps just instinctively knew to do. He didn't nudge. He didn't lick. He climbed. He forced his powerful body onto Stuart's coiled, shaking frame. He hooked his front paws over the man's shoulders, pressing him down, and then draped his entire torso and head across Stuart's back, covering him, pinning him to the earth with his full weight. It was deep-pressure therapy, a living, breathing anchor in the middle of a phantom war. Stuart fought it for a second. He was trapped. The enemy was on him. He struggled, but the dog was too heavy, too persistent. And then Apollo, still pressing him down, pushed his wet head under Stuart's arm and began to frantically lick his face, his ear, his neck. The sensation was immediate, tactile, and real. It was warm. It smelled like dog. The smell cut through the phantom smell of cordite.
The wet fur cut through the memory of his flak jacket. Stuart? A voice. His own? Apollo whined, a high-pitched, desperate sound. The shaking in Stuart's body began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering tremor. The roar on the roof was just rain. The smell was just damp earth. The weight on his back was not the enemy. It was Apollo. "Oh, God," Stuart wept, his voice breaking. He unlaced his hands from his neck and weakly wrapped them around the dog, clinging to the thick, wet fur. "It's okay, boy. It's okay. I'm here. I'm here." He buried his face in Apollo's neck, holding on to the dog as if he were the only solid thing on earth. The worst of the storm passed, settling into a hard, steady downpour. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom of the shed, finding the two figures on the floor. Patricia stood in the doorway, soaked to the skin, the flashlight in her hand shaking violently. She saw her husband, the man she loved, huddled on the dirt floor, clinging to his dog. He was covered in mud and sweat, his face pale, his eyes hollowed out by the terror he had just endured. He looked up, his eyes cleared, but filled with a profound, crushing shame. "Trish," he whispered, his voice raw. He couldn't meet her eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Patricia stared at him. The fear she had felt was suddenly eclipsed by a wave of pure, cold anger, not at him, but at the war, at the thing that had broken him. She stepped into the shed, her boots sinking into the mud. She did not cry. Her voice was fierce, trembling with the effort of holding herself together. "I don't need you to be sorry, Stuart." She knelt in the mud in front of him, forcing him to look at her. The flashlight beam illuminated their faces. "I need you here," she said, her voice breaking. "With us. I need you to be here, Stuart. Just be here." He looked at his wife, truly seeing her for the first time in weeks. He saw the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion, the strength that was holding their entire world together. He let go of Apollo and reached out, his hand shaking, and touched her face. Slowly, leaning on each other, with Apollo pressed against their side, the three of them made their way out of the dark shed and walked back to the house through the rain. In the days following the storm, a fragile, unspoken truce settled over the Strange household. The oppressive, electric tension in the air had broken, and the rains had washed the world clean, leaving it merely hot and damp. Stuart was different. He had not retreated into his shell. True to Patricia's demand, he was there. He sat at the kitchen table in the mornings, drinking coffee, his hands still trembling slightly, but his eyes present. He listened when Diana read a passage from her book aloud. He watched Mike in the yard. He was quiet, haunted, and deeply exhausted. But he was no longer a ghost. Patricia, seeing this effort, felt a sliver of desperate hope. She moved around him with a gentle, cautious energy, as if tending to a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. Apollo, for his part, rarely left Stuart's side. He seemed to understand that his job as an anchor was more critical than ever. He no longer slept on his mat by the door. He now slept on the floor at the foot of Stuart and Patricia's bed, a solid, breathing presence in the dark.
The war for the treehouse seemed to have been forgotten. The Wilsons had not returned. Mike, perhaps sensing the fragility of the peace inside his own home, had not pushed the issue. He and Diana had spent the last 2 days patching the roof of the fortress, but the work was subdued, lacking its former manic energy. The peace lasted for 4 days. On the 5th night, the heat returned with a vengeance. It was a suffocating, windless night, the kind where the red clay itself seemed to radiate the day's sun back into the air. The cicadas, silent during the storm, were screaming, a wall of sound that offered no relief. Inside the house, everyone was asleep, or pretending to be. Mike and Diana were in their beds, sheets kicked off. In the master bedroom, Patricia slept fitfully, the box fan in the window doing little more than pushing the hot air around. Stuart was not asleep.
He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the cicadas, fighting the memories they stirred. At the foot of the bed, Apollo, who had been breathing in deep, steady rhythm, suddenly went still. Stuart felt the change before he heard it. The dog's breathing just stopped. A second later, Apollo's head lifted. He did not growl. He did not move. He tasted the air. "What is it, boy?" Stuart whispered into the dark. Apollo slid off the foot of the bed, his claws making a faint ticking sound on the wooden floor. He moved to the bedroom door, which was ajar, and stood, his body rigid, his head low, sniffing the air coming from the back of the house. A low growl rumbled in his chest, so deep it was more a vibration than a sound. Stuart was out of bed instantly. The fragile peace was gone. This was familiar territory. He grabbed his jeans from the chair. "Trish," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "Wake up! Stay here!" Patricia sat up, her heart leaping into her throat. "What, Stuart? What is it?" "Something's outside," he said. He followed Apollo, who was now moving quickly, silently, toward the back kitchen door. The dog didn't scratch. He just stood, his nose pressed to the crack. The low, menacing growl, now steady. He smelled them. He smelled the familiar, unwelcome scent of the Wilsons, and he smelled something else. Mud. Stuart looked out the kitchen window into the pitch-black yard. He could see nothing. He could hear only the cicadas. "Maybe it's just a raccoon," Patricia whispered, joining him, clutching her thin robe. "No," Stuart said. "He doesn't do this for raccoons." Just then, from the direction of the woods came a faint, muffled sound. It was the heavy crack of a thick piece of wood splitting, followed by a low, triumphant laugh. The sound hit Mike's room like a gunshot. He was awake instantly. "They're here!" Mike and Diana tumbled out of their rooms. "Who? What's happening?" Diana's voice was filled with sleep and panic. "The fortress," Mike said, his face pale in the moonlight. Apollo, hearing the sound, confirmed the threat. He let out a single, sharp, explosive bark. It was not a warning. It was an alarm. "Stay inside," Stuart ordered, grabbing the heavy flashlight from the counter. "Lock the door behind me." "Stuart, no!" Patricia cried, but Apollo was already launching himself against the screen door, his barks now fast and furious. Stuart shoved the door open, and the dog burst into the night, a gray-white streak disappearing into the darkness. "Mike, I said stay here!" Stuart yelled. But his son was gone. Mike had bolted out the door right behind the dog, barefoot and wearing only his sleeping shorts. "Mike!" Stuart roared, his heart seizing with a new kind of terror. He sprinted off the porch, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the blackness, his bad leg aching in protest. Diana ran onto the porch, her hands covering her mouth. "Dad! Mike! Be careful!" Stuart's flashlight beam found Apollo first. The dog was at the base of the oak tree, barking furiously, not at an enemy, but at the tree itself. Then the beam found Mike. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, his body illuminated in the white circle of light. The fortress was gone. It was not just damaged, it was desecrated. The Wilsons had done their work with a vicious, silent efficiency. The sturdy ladder Mike and Diana had built was smashed, its rungs kicked out, the side rails splintered. The platform itself was in ruins. The boards had been torn up, the supports kicked apart, the ropes they had used for pulleys were cut, the ends dangling uselessly. But the worst was the mud. They had used buckets of it. The red clay, mixed into a thick slurry, had been smeared over every surface. The walls, the floor, the trunk of the tree, all of it was covered in the viscous, dripping ooze. And in the very center of the platform, drawn in huge, crude letters with the same red mud, was a single, insulting word: cowards. Mike stared at it. He did not cry. He did not move. He just stared. "Mike," Stewart said, his voice rough. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. The boy was trembling, his small body vibrating with a rage so cold and profound it dwarfed the heat of the night. They waited," Mike whispered. His voice was choked, unrecognizable. "They waited till we were asleep, like thieves." Stewart shone the light around the clearing, his jaw tight. He saw the tracks, 2 sets of them. He recognized the tactical, malicious nature of the attack. It was meant to demoralize. It was meant to break them. He saw his son's face, and he realized, with a sickening lurch, that it had worked. Apollo, his alarm barking finished, was now sniffing the base of the tree, whining, his body agitated. He looked at Mike, then at the woods, as if asking for the order to track them, to go after them. "No, boy," Stewart said, his voice heavy. "They're long gone." He pulled his son close. "Let's go back to the house, Mike. There's nothing we can do tonight." Mike allowed himself to be led, his feet dragging, his eyes still fixed on the muddy, ruined kingdom behind him. He was silent the entire next day. He sat through breakfast, pushing food around his plate, his eyes dark. Patricia and Stewart exchanged worried glances but left him alone. Diana tried to talk to him, but he just shook his head. After lunch, he stood up from the table, his movements stiff, and walked out the back door. Diana, her heart sinking, followed him. She found him in the shed, the same shed their father had hidden in during the storm. He was not rebuilding. He was arming. He had 2 old 5-gallon paint buckets and was methodically filling them with red clay, adding water from the rain barrel, stirring the mixture with a broken broom handle. It was the same thick red slurry that had been used to desecrate their fortress. "Mike, what are you doing?" Diana asked, her voice small. "What does it look like?" Mike said. He didn't look at her. "They want to play with mud. We'll play." He gestured to a corner of the shed. There he had laid out his new arsenal: rolls of fishing line, empty tin cans, and a pile of sharp-pointed pine branches he was stripping of their needles. Traps. Diana's blood ran cold. This was not the frustrated anger of a boy who had hit his thumb. This was the same cold, focused rage she had seen in her father. This was the violence she had glimpsed in Apollo's eyes. "You're making bombs," she whispered, horrified. "Mud bombs," he corrected her, his voice flat. "And snares. And pitfalls. I'm going to line the entire path. The next time they come, they'll be sorry."
"Mike, stop," Diana pleaded, grabbing his arm. "This is wrong. This isn't a game anymore." "It was never a game, Diana," he said, yanking his arm away. "You're scaring me," she cried. "Listen to yourself. We're starting to act just like him." She didn't have to say who. The air was thick with the implication. The man on the porch. The man in the shed during the storm. "Mike, we're doing exactly what Dad went through. This is a war. Dad won't like this." For the first time, Mike stopped and looked at her. His face, smeared with red clay, was hard and unfamiliar, the face of a stranger. "So what? You want to just let them win? Let them break our stuff and just walk away?" "No, but this—" "You don't get it," he said, turning his back on her, his voice filled with contempt. "You're just like Mom. You're scared. Go back to the house, Diana. This isn't for you." He plunged his hands back into the thick red mud, his entire being consumed by one single burning thought: retaliation. Diana stood in the doorway, tears stinging her eyes. She looked at her brother, his back rigid with anger, and she knew she had lost him. The war the Wilsons had started had finally claimed its first true soldier. Diana stumbled out of the shed, her face streaked with tears and red clay. She had failed. The brother she knew, the one who built model airplanes and read comic books, was gone. In his place was a small, hard-eyed stranger stirring a bucket of mud with a broken broom handle. She ran into the house, slamming the screen door. The rattling sound it made caused Patricia to look up from the potatoes she was peeling. "Diana? Honey, what's wrong? What's that on your face?" Diana just shook her head, unable to speak, and pointed back toward the shed. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, gripped Patricia. She dropped the peeler into the sink, wiped her wet hands on her apron, and walked outside. The mid-afternoon sun was brutal, but she felt chilled. She walked to the shed and stood in the doorway. The smell hit her first, damp, sour earth. Then her eyes adjusted to the dim light. She saw her son, his back to her, working with a focused, methodical intensity. She saw the buckets of thick, dark slurry. And then she saw the arsenal. Lying on an old tarp were the tools of his new war, the fishing line, the tin cans, and the sticks. There were perhaps a dozen of them, pine branches, whittled to wicked sharp points at one end. Patricia's breath hitched. Her mind, conditioned by 2 years of nightmare-inducing news broadcasts, made an instant, horrifying leap. She wasn't looking at pine branches. She was looking at punji sticks, the kind of primitive, vicious trap she had read about in letters, the kind that lurked in the jungles of her husband's mind. This was not a game. This was not a childhood feud. This was something else. This was an infection. She turned without a word and walked back to the house, moving with a stiff, furious energy. She stalked through the kitchen, through the living room, and onto the front porch. Stuart was there, as he always was. Greetings in the rocking chair, his gaze fixed on the heat rising from the road. Apollo was at his feet, his head resting on Stuart's boot, the picture of stillness. Patricia stepped onto the porch. The floorboards groaned. Apollo's head came up, his tail giving a single, hopeful thump. Stuart turned his head slowly. She was holding one of the sharpened sticks.
She held it out to him, her hand trembling, but not from weakness. It was trembling with a rage so profound it made her voice low and dangerous. "What is this, Stuart?" He looked at the stick, then at her. His eyes were blank, confused. "It's a stick, Trish. What?" "He's making weapons," Patricia said, her voice shaking. "Our son, our 11-year-old boy is in the shed, making weapons." Stuart's gaze faltered. He looked down at his hands. "It's just the Wilson boys. Kids get into scraps. They'll sort it out." "Sort it out?" Her voice cracked and a raw, hysterical sound, half laugh, half sob, escaped her. "Is that what you call it? He's not sorting it out, Stuart. He is learning from you." Stuart flinched as if she had struck him. "What are you talking about? I haven't taught him anything." "Exactly!" she shouted, and Apollo, sensing the sudden sharp shift in emotion, scrambled to his feet, whining and pushing his head against Stuart's leg. "You've taught him everything," Patricia continued, the words pouring out, the dam of her exhaustion finally breaking. "You've taught him that when you're hurt, you go silent. You've taught him that the world is a place to hide from. And now you're teaching him that the only way to solve a problem is with violence." "That's not fair," Stuart whispered, his face pale. "He's in that shed," she pressed on, relentless, tears now streaming down her face. "He is full of rage, and he has a father who won't even talk to him. He's turning that forest into your war, Stuart. He's digging in. He's setting traps. My God, don't you see? He's becoming a ghost just like you." The accusation hung in the thick, hot air, more violent than any thunderclap. Stuart looked away, his jaw working, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He was shutting down. She could see it, the retreat, the eyes going flat and distant. She stepped forward and gripped his arm. "No," she commanded. "Don't you dare!" "Don't you dare leave me. I have spent 2 years fighting to get you back from that jungle. I will not lose my son to it, too." She was pleading now, her anger broken by pure, terrified grief. "I've already lost you, Stuart. Don't make me lose him. Talk to him, please, before it's too late." Stuart looked at his wife's face, at the desperation that had finally broken through her strength. He looked at the sharpened stick she still held. He looked down at Apollo, who was watching him with an unbearable, knowing anxiety. He had been asked to do the one thing he was no longer sure he knew how to do. Slowly, his body aching, he nodded. He found Mike in the shed, still stirring his bucket of mud. The boy's face and arms were caked in the drying red clay, making him look like a small, tribal warrior. "Mike," Stuart said. His voice was quiet, but it held a new authority, a tone Mike had not heard since before his father had left. Mike stopped stirring. "Come to the porch," Stuart said. "Now." Mike hesitated, his eyes narrowed, but there was no room for argument in his father's voice. He dropped the stick and followed, his bare feet leaving muddy tracks on the kitchen floor. Stuart sat on the top step of the porch, the same spot where he had sat for weeks. He gestured for Mike to sit next to him. Mike sat, stiff and resentful, leaving a gap between them. The cicadas screamed in the trees. The air was heavy. Apollo came out and, sensing the deep, awkward chasm between them, lay down in the gap, bridging it. He rested his heavy head on Stuart's knee, but his tail was curled against Mike's leg. Stuart stared at the yard for a long time. He didn't know how to begin. He had no map for this. "Your mother," he started, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat. "She says you're making traps." Mike's jaw set. "They destroyed our fortress.
They're cowards. They deserve it." "They deserve it," Stuart repeated, nodding slowly. "I've thought that before. Many times." Mike looked at his father, surprised. This wasn't the lecture he was expecting. "I know you're angry," Stuart said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know what that kind of anger feels like. It's hot, and it makes your hands shake. It makes you want to hurt something, to break it, just like they broke your fortress." Mike said nothing, but his tight defensive posture eased just slightly. "In the jungle, that's all there was," Stuart said, his eyes going distant, but this time he was not retreating. He was remembering. "After a while, you forget about the flags, the reasons. You just hate. You hate the man in front of you. You hate the rain. You hate the heat. And you'll do anything to make it stop." He reached down and unconsciously stroked Apollo's head, his fingers gripping the fur. "You think if you hurt them," he continued, "if you make them pay, you'll win. You think it'll make you feel strong. You think that anger will finally go away and you'll feel better." He turned and looked at his son, his blue eyes clear and filled with a terrible, ancient sadness. "It doesn't, Mike." The boy stared at him, confused. "It doesn't make you feel strong," Stuart said, his voice breaking, but he pushed on. "When you hurt someone, really hurt them, you don't feel like a winner. You don't feel proud. You just feel empty. You feel cold." He held his son's gaze. "And the worst part is, you look at what you've done. You look at the person you hurt, and you realize you've just become the very thing you hated. You become the bully. You become the one who breaks things in the dark." He delivered the final, painful lesson. "That kind of violence, that hate, it doesn't make you strong, Mike. It doesn't make you right. It just turns you into what you despise." Stuart looked away, exhausted by the effort, by the proximity to truths he had tried to bury. "You do what you have to do," he whispered. "But that's the truth of it. That's all I know." He sat there for another moment, then, with a deep groan, he pushed himself to his feet. He looked down at his son, whose face was no longer hard with anger, but was now a mask of deep, painful confusion. Stuart wanted to touch his head, to pull him close, but he didn't know how. Instead, he just rested his hand on Apollo's head. "Good boy," he murmured. He turned and walked back into the house, the screen door shutting with a soft, final sound. Mike sat on the step, alone in the suffocating heat. He stared at the pointed stick his mother had left on the porch rail. He looked at his hands, caked in the red, warlike mud. He wasn't a triumphant warrior anymore. He was just a confused, 11-year-old boy. Apollo, sensing the shift, moved over. He didn't whine. He just rested his heavy chin on Mike's knee, a silent, solid presence, waiting. For 2 days, Mike Strange lived in a haze of confusion. His father's words had landed like a heavy stone, sinking deep, leaving him cold and empty. The anger was gone, but the shame of his ruined fortress remained, a constant, dull ache. He did not return to the shed. He did not touch the pointed sticks. But the Wilsons did not know that. On the third afternoon, a Friday, Mike and Diana were sitting on the back porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl, the silence broken only by the rhythmic plink of the peas landing.
Apollo was dozing in a patch of sun, his tail twitching in a dream. A new sound cut through the heat. It was a jeering laugh coming from the woods. "Hey, cowards! You fix your junk pile yet?" Mike's head snapped up. Dave Wilson. He was back. All the confusion, all the cold emptiness vanished. In its place, the hot, familiar rage returned, clearer and sharper than before. His father's words were just sounds. This was real. "Mike, don't," Diana whispered, her hand gripping his arm. He shook her off. He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, staring at the woods. "You want to fight?" he yelled, his voice shaking. "Come on, then!" "We'll be there." The laughter echoed again, followed by the sound of the Wilsons retreating. Mike turned and walked into the house. He found his two neighborhood friends, Tom and Sam, who had helped him build the fortress. Tom was lanky and quiet. Sam was short and barrel-chested. "They're coming back," Mike said, his voice flat and cold. "This time, we finish it." This time Diana did not argue. She just watched him, her face pale. She saw the look in his eyes, the one she had seen in the shed. The war was back on. Within an hour, the fortress was remanned. They had repaired the ladder, just barely. They had hauled up the buckets of red mud, which were now thick and rank in the heat. They had their slingshots, and Mike had his master trap. A heavy rope was tied to the handle of the largest bucket, which was filled with mud, gravel, and small, heavy pebbles. The rope was looped over a high branch, its other end tied off on the platform. The plan was simple. When the Wilsons were under the platform, Mike would cut the rope. Apollo, sensing the frenetic, angry energy, did not go up the ladder. He paced anxiously at the base of the oak, whining low in his throat. They waited. The cicadas screamed. Then they appeared. Dave, Pete, and this time a third, older-looking boy Mike didn't recognize. They emerged from the trees, walking with an arrogant swagger. "Here come the mud turtles!" Dave yelled. "Now!" Mike screamed. The battle erupted. It was pure chaos, the air filled with the sharp thwip of slingshots and the shouts of boys. Mud bombs, balloons filled with the red slurry, flew from the fortress, bursting against the trees with wet, slapping sounds. The Wilsons charged, using barrel lids as shields. A rock from Dave's slingshot whizzed past Mike's ear, striking the oak with a loud, sharp crack. "They're getting closer!" Sam yelled, ducking. "Keep throwing," Mike ordered. He was high above them, the king in his castle, his heart pounding with a wild, terrifying power. "They're at the ladder!" Tom shouted. Mike looked down. Dave and the older boy were at the base of the tree, trying to shake the ladder. Pete, smaller and terrified by the rain of mud, was trying to hide behind his older brother. "Come on, Pete! Get over here!" Dave yelled, yanking his brother and shoving him roughly behind his own body, taking the brunt of a mud bomb that splattered across his back. Mike saw it. He saw the bully, the enemy, instinctively shielding his little brother. He saw himself, his hand already on the knife he had brought to cut the rope. He was about to unleash his biggest trap, the bucket of rocks and gravel, directly onto the two boys below. His father's voice, quiet and full of a terrible sadness, cut through the noise. "You've just become the very thing you hated." Mike looked at his hand on the knife. He looked at Dave, who was just a boy, protecting his brother. He was the one on high. He was the one with the traps. He was the one about to inflict real pain. The blood drained from his face. No, he whispered. Mike! Do it! Cut the rope! Sam yelled. Mike recoiled from the rope as if it were a snake. Stop! He screamed, his voice cracking. Everyone just stop it! The shouting died. Tom and Sam froze, their arms still raised, mud dripping from their hands. Below, Dave and the other boys looked up, confused, breathing hard. The only sound was the drip of mud and the high, thin whine of the cicadas. The sudden silence was as loud as the battle had been. What? Dave panted, squinting. You given up, little man? Into that silence a new sound bloomed. It was not a shout. It was a thin, high-pitched, wailing cry. It was a sound of pure, abject terror. Help! Help me! I can't! Everyone froze. Dave's head whipped around. The color drained from his face. Pete! He looked at the spot where his brother had been. It was empty. Pete! Dave shouted, his voice cracking with a sudden, genuine panic. Where are you? P-E-T-E exclamation mark. The crying was muffled, coming from somewhere off to the side. It hurts. I'm stuck. The boys, Mike, Tom, Sam, Dave, and the other, all scrambled down from their positions, their war instantly forgotten. They stood in the clearing, looking wildly around. Where is he? Mike asked, his own voice shaking. I don't know. I can't see him, Dave yelled. The crying was coming from the direction of a small gully about 30 yards away, completely overgrown with a thick, tangled mass of wild blackberry bushes, heavy with thorns. Apollo, who had been barking frantically during the entire fight, suddenly went rigid. His head went up, his ears pivoted. He had the sound. He burst past the group of stunned boys. He didn't run to the fortress. He ran straight to the edge of the dense, thorny gully. He stopped, his front paws braced, and began to bark, a sharp, urgent, continuous sound directed at the impenetrable wall of thorns. Diana, who had been watching the entire battle from the edge of the yard, her hand pressed over her mouth, started running. She didn't stop to ask questions. She ran past Mike. She ran past Dave. She ran straight to where Apollo was barking. "He's in there!" she yelled. She plunged into the bushes, the thorns tearing at her arms, not caring. "Pete, where are you?" "Here!" his voice wailed from below. The boys arrived just as Diana pushed aside the last of the branches. Pete had panicked during the fighting. He had run blindly and had fallen straight into the gully, which was deeper than it looked. He was tangled in the vines, his ankle bent at an unnatural angle, but worse, his shin had landed on a jagged, half-buried rock. Blood, dark and arterial, was welling from a long, deep gash, soaking his jeans. The boys just stared. Dave looked like he was going to be sick. Mike was frozen, his mind screaming, "This is my fault. This is my war." Diana didn't hesitate. She didn't cry. She didn't wait for permission. With both hands, she grabbed the hem of her own cotton t-shirt. With a strength none of them knew she possessed, she gave a violent pull. The ripping sound of the fabric tearing cut through the air. She ripped a long, thick strip of blue cotton free. She knelt in the dirt and thorns beside the crying boy, her hands steady. "It's okay, Pete," she said, her voice firm and calm, a sudden island of authority in the chaos. "I'm going to wrap this. It's going to be tight, okay? But it'll help." She wrapped the cloth around his leg, pulling it tight against the wound, her hands quickly becoming slick with his blood. The bleeding slowed. The war was over. The clearing was silent.
The only sounds were the high, terrified whimpers of Pete Wilson and the ripping of cotton. Diana worked with a desperate, focused calm, her hands covered in the bright, shocking red of Pete's blood. The makeshift tourniquet was tight. The bleeding slowed. Dave Wilson just stood there, his face the color of ash. The arrogance, the meanness, all of it had vanished. He was just a scared older brother watching his sibling bleed into the red clay. We got to get him home," Dave stammered, his voice unrecognizable. He and the other older boy, the friend he'd brought, wordlessly created a chair carry with their arms. They lifted Pete, whose face was white with pain. "It hurts, Dave," Pete cried. "I know, buddy, I know." "We're going home," Dave said, his voice thick. He looked at Mike just once, his eyes filled with a new cold hatred that was far more terrifying than his earlier bullying. You did this." Then they were gone, crashing through the woods, leaving Mike, Diana, and their friends alone in the ruined clearing, with the blood-soaked thorns and the overturned mud buckets. The walk back to the house was the longest of their lives. Tom and Sam, the neighborhood friends, mumbled their goodbyes at the edge of the yard and scattered, disappearing toward their own homes, not wanting to be present for the inevitable fallout. Mike and Diana were left alone. Mike was covered in mud. Diana's blue shirt was torn, and the front of her jeans was dark with another boy's blood. They walked onto the back porch. Patricia was standing at the screen door, her face a mask of dread. Stuart was behind her, standing in the kitchen doorway. "What happened?" Patricia asked, her voice quiet. "Diana? Are you hurt? Is that—" "It's not mine," Diana whispered. She was shaking, the adrenaline fading, leaving her cold despite the heat. "It's Pete. Pete Wilson. He fell. In the gully. He's hurt bad, Mom. There was a lot of blood." Mike said nothing. He walked past them, his face muddy and blank. He went into the small bathroom and shut the door. The sound of the shower running was the only sound in the house. Stuart looked at his wife. She was staring at the blood on her daughter's shirt. He looked at the woods. He looked at Apollo, who had followed them back and was now sitting by the porch steps, panting, his head low, sensing the heavy, waiting dread. Stuart knew, with the certainty of a soldier who has survived an ambush, that this was not the end. This was just the lull. The counterattack was coming. It came an hour later. The sound came first, not a backfire, but the deliberate, angry roar of a V8 engine being pushed too hard, coming too fast down their dirt road. The sound of tires skidding in the gravel was followed by a loud slam of a truck door. "Stay inside," Stuart said to Patricia and Diana. He moved onto the front porch, letting the screen door swing shut behind him. Apollo was instantly at his side, pressing against his leg. A man stormed through the dust cloud his truck had kicked up. He was a big man, broader than Stuart, with a farmer's powerful build. His face was baked red by the sun, and his light blue eyes were narrowed in a blaze of pure, unrestrained fury. He wore faded denim overalls over a sweat-soaked t-shirt. This was John Wilson. He did not slow down. He marched straight to the bottom step of the porch, jabbing a thick, dirt-caked finger at Stuart. "You!" he bellowed, his voice a raw roar that seemed to shake the porch. "Strange! Your boy! What kind of house are you running here?" Stuart stood still, his hands loose at his sides. "Mr. Wilson." "Don't you Mr. Wilson me!" John roared, stepping up onto the first step, violating Stuart's space. "My boy is at the clinic, getting stitches, a dozen of them. He could have bled out in that ditch." From inside, Mike, his skin scrubbed raw but still wearing his muddy shorts, watched through the screen, his face pale with guilt. John Wilson saw the movement. He pointed his finger past Stewart, at the boy. "You! Your kid. Him and his traps. His goddamned booby traps. You think this is a game? I ought to take a strap to him. And you!" He turned his full fury back on Stewart, who was standing directly in front of him, silent. "What's wrong with you? You just gonna stand there? You gonna let your kid try to kill mine and just stand there like a damn statue?" The confrontation was too direct. The yelling, the spitting rage, the finger jabbing inches from his face, the unrestrained masculine aggression. It was too much. Stewart Strange did not flinch. He did not retreat. He simply left. The porch, the man, the heat, it all dissolved. The roaring in his ears was not John Wilson. It was the rotor wash of a Huey. The man screaming at him was not a father. He was an accuser in a village square, his face contorted in a language Stewart couldn't understand. The situation was escalating. It was about to become violent. And he was frozen. His breathing stopped. The color drained from his face. His blue eyes went flat, vacant and utterly still, staring through the angry man in front of him. He was gone. "Say something!" John Wilson shouted, grabbing the porch rail, ready to come up farther. But the man he was yelling at was no longer there. Apollo, pressed against Stewart's leg, felt the change. He felt the solid muscle turn to stone. He felt the life, the tension, the presence of his master evaporate. The man was rigid, locked, no longer breathing. The dog whined, a high, sharp sound of panic. He pushed his head against Stewart's hand, but the hand was dead. It didn't respond. This was wrong. This was the shed. This was the storm. Apollo shoved his body hard against Stewart's legs, trying to get a reaction. Nothing. The man was a statue. In a move of pure desperate instinct, Apollo shoved himself between Stewart's legs from behind. He forced the man's locked knees apart, and then leaned his entire 90-pound weight forward, bracing himself against the back of Stewart's legs. He was a living anchor, a physical prop, the only thing holding the frozen man upright. He looked up at Stewart's blank, terrifying face and let out another high, piercing whine. John Wilson, in the middle of his tirade, stopped. His rage, which had been a white-hot fire, hit the cold, silent wall of Stewart's emptiness. And it just died. He looked at the man he had been screaming at. He saw the eyes. He was a farmer, yes, but he had spent 2 frozen winters outside of Seoul. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mess tent. He had seen it on patrol. He had seen it in the mirror. It was the 1,000-yard stare. Then he looked down. He saw the dog. It wasn't growling. It wasn't threatening him. The dog was holding the man up. The dog was desperately trying to pull its master back from a place John Wilson knew all too well. The anger drained out of him, leaving a hollow, bitter exhaustion in its place. The heat, the adrenaline, the fear for his son, it all collapsed, leaving him feeling old and tired. He stepped back off the porch. He ran a hand over his face, his calloused palm scraping over his stubble. "Hell," he muttered, turning away. He looked at the dust on his truck. He looked at the screaming hot blue sky. "My son, your son," he said, his voice no longer a roar but a low, gravelly rumble of defeat. "Our kids, they're both stupid." The silence stretched. The pressure of the dog against his legs, the high-pitched whine, the sudden, total absence of the threat.
Stuart blinked. The porch floorboards reappeared under his feet, the smell of pine and dust. The man in the yard was no longer an enemy. He was just a man. Tired. He was back. He was breathing, a deep, shuddering gasp. His hand, shaking, found the top of Apollo's head, his fingers gripping the thick fur. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He looked at John Wilson, who was still facing his truck, his shoulders slumped. Stuart leaned heavily on his dog, the only thing that felt real. "Yeah," Stuart said. John Wilson turned, surprised to hear a voice. Stuart met his gaze. He was the father. He was the man Patricia had begged for. He was present. "Then they'll have to fix it together." John stared at him for a long moment. He saw the emptiness in Stuart's eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary resolve. He wasn't looking at a statue anymore. He was looking at a man he almost understood. John Wilson gave a short, bitter nod. He didn't say another word. He turned, climbed into his truck, and drove away. Slowly this time, leaving a trail of quiet dust in the heavy afternoon air. The next morning, the sun rose with a white-hot intensity, promising another day of brutal, suffocating heat. The truce, brokered by two exhausted fathers, was to be enforced. Stuart was the one to wake Mike. He didn't just call him. He came into his son's room and stood by the bed until Mike opened his eyes. "It's time," Stuart said. His voice was quiet, but it was not the voice of the ghost. It was the voice of the man who had nodded at John Wilson. "Get your shoes. We have work to do." Mike was sullen, his body heavy with shame and a lingering, resentful anger. He had been the general of a war, and now he was a prisoner, forced to clean up the battlefield. He said nothing, just pulled on his shirt and sneakers. In the kitchen, Patricia had a box of nails and 2 hammers on the table. She looked at Mike, then at Diana, who was standing nervously by the door. "Your father and we expect you to do this right. No more fighting." "It wasn't me who started it," Mike muttered, staring at the floor. "It doesn't matter who started it," Stuart said from the doorway. "It matters who finishes it. Let's go." They walked to the ruined oak tree as a family. Stuart, Mike, Diana, and Apollo, who trotted alongside them, oblivious to the human tension, just happy to be on a morning walk. When they reached the clearing, the Wilsons were already there. John Wilson's rusty Ford truck was parked at the edge of the woods. John was leaning against the fender, arms crossed. Dave was standing beside him, kicking at the dirt. His face was a mask of sullen anger. He wore the same cut-off shorts, his bare back already gleaming with sweat. Pete was not with them. John Wilson looked at Stuart and gave a single curt nod. Stuart nodded back. The two fathers looked at the children. "Right," John said, his voice a low rumble. "My boy's at home, leg propped on a pillow, can't walk for a week. Seems to me you all got a lot of work to do." He looked at Dave. "You'll work till it's fixed, you hear me?" Dave just grunted, his eyes fixed on Mike with a look of pure loathing. Stuart looked at his son. "Mike, Diana, you too. That ladder won't fix itself." With that, the two fathers turned and walked away, their paths diverging back toward their respective homes. They were leaving the children alone. It was a test. The silence that descended was heavier and hotter than the air.
It was a standoff. Mike, Diana, and Dave. The three of them stood in the clearing, surrounded by the wreckage of their war. The air was thick with humidity, the buzzing of flies, and an almost unbearable, unspoken hostility. Finally, Diana, always the peacemaker, took a tentative step. "Well," she said, her voice too bright, "the ladder's the first thing, I guess." She picked up one of the broken side rails. Mike, his face tight, grabbed the other. They started trying to piece it together, but the wood was splintered. Dave watched them for a full minute. Then, with a sigh of disgust, he stalked over to the pile of ruined boards on the platform. With a loud, angry grunt, he tore a half-broken board free and threw it to the ground. He began the work of clearing the platform, making as much noise as possible. They worked for an hour. The only sounds were the scrape of wood, the occasional sharp tap-tap of Mike's hammer as he tried to nail a split rung, and the steady, deafening scream of the cicadas. No one spoke. They worked in separate, hostile orbits. Mike and Diana at the base of the tree, Dave on the platform above. The tension was a living thing, a fourth person in the clearing. Mike's hands were clumsy with shame. Every time he swung the hammer, his eyes strayed to the gully, to the dark, rust-colored stains on the leaves where Pete had fallen. His father's words echoed in his head. "You just become the very thing you hated." He was the thing he hated. Diana, sensing the standoff, tried again. "Dave?" she called up, her voice trembling slightly. Do you need us to pass up that other board?" Dave, his back slick with sweat, didn't even turn around. He just spat over the side of the platform. "I got it." Mike flinched, his anger flaring again. He hit the next nail too hard and the wood split with a sharp cracking sound. He swore under his breath and threw the hammer down. Apollo, who had been lying in the shade with the patience of a saint, was getting restless. He was hot. The ground was hard. The humans were tense, and it was making him anxious. And he was bored. He got up, stretched his long gray body, and shook the dust from his coat. He trotted around the clearing, sniffing. He sniffed the bloody thorns, and a low whine rumbled in his chest. He sniffed the base of the tree. Then he found the buckets. They were still there, near the shed where Mike had left them. The mud bombs. The sun had baked the top layer into a dry red crust, but underneath, the slurry of clay and old rainwater was thick, rank, and, to a hot dog, irresistibly cool. He nuded the bucket with his nose. A wet, sloppy splashing sound came from within. His ears perked up. He stuck his head into the bucket. It was cool. It smelled like rich, dark earth. It was wonderful. He put a front paw in, testing it. The bucket tipped. With a gleeful grunt, Apollo knocked the entire 5-gallon bucket over, creating a massive, glorious puddle of thick, red-brown ooze. He was in heaven. He pounced, rolled, and wiggled, his powerful back scratching against the ground, his paws in the air. In 10 seconds, the magnificent gray and white German shepherd was gone. In his place was a creature made entirely of red, dripping clay. The sound of the dog's happy splashing finally broke the human's concentration. "Apollo! No!" Diana cried out, horrified. "Get out of that! You'll... Ugh!" But it was too late. Apollo, having coated himself thoroughly, stood up. He was delighted. He felt cool. He felt refreshed. And he wanted to share his joy. The 3 children were standing frozen, staring at him. Mike, by the ladder, Diana 10 feet away, Dave, having just climbed down, near the gully. They formed a perfect triangle. Apollo, dripping with mud, trotted happily into the exact center of that triangle. "Oh no,"
Diana whispered, her eyes wide. "Apollo, don't." The dog braced himself, gathering his powerful muscles. He was a 90-pound animal, covered in at least 10 pounds of liquid mud. Then he shook. It was a full-body, violent, corkscrewing shake, starting from his head and ending with his tail. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A heavy, wet spray of red clay erupted in all directions. It was not a fine mist. It was thick, heavy, clumpy spatters of mud. A wet, slapping sound echoed as the first volley hit. A huge glob splattered across Mike's clean white t-shirt, leaving a streak that looked like a bloody handprint. A spray of it caught Dave across his bare back, shocking him with its sudden cold wetness. And a particularly well-aimed clump flew directly into Diana's face, coating her cheek and her mouth. For one single, horrifying second, the world stopped. The three children were frozen, dripping. They stared at each other, covered in the very mud that had been the symbol of their war. Apollo, finished, let out a single, happy bark. Playtime? Diana, her face a mask of mud, sputtered. A small bubble of clay formed on her lips and popped. A sound came out of her. It wasn't a word. It was a snort. She tried to hold it in, but the absurdity of the moment, the heat, the hatred, the blood, and now this ridiculous, happy, filthy dog was too much. A giggle escaped. Then another.
And then Diana Strange, who had been holding the fear of her entire family on her shoulders, threw her head back and laughed. It was a real, unrestrained, hysterical peal of laughter. Mike stared at his sister as if she were insane. Then he looked at Dave. Dave had a huge glob of mud slowly, comically, sliding down from his ear. He was glaring at the dog with a look of utter disbelief. Mike looked at his own mud-soaked shirt. He looked at Diana, who was laughing so hard she was doubled over. A slow smile cracked across Mike's face. It was the first real smile in weeks. He started to chuckle. Dave, the tough guy, wiped the mud from his ear. He looked at the brown gunk on his hand. He looked at the happy, panting dog. A reluctant, strangled snort came from his nose. He tried to fight it, but he couldn't. He cracked a grin. "Stupid dog," Dave muttered, but all the malice was gone from his voice. He got you right in the ear," Mike managed to say, pointing. "He got you in the mouth, genius," Dave retorted, and his snort turned into a short, barking laugh. The ice wasn't just broken. It was shattered. The three of them stood there for a full minute, surrounded by their ruined fortress, laughing at the dog who had just baptized them all in the weapon of their war. After a moment, Diana wiped her face. "Well," she said, her voice still shaky with laughter, "I guess we're all dirty now." She picked up the hammer. "Come on, let's finish this." The work resumed, but the silence was different. It was no longer hostile. "Here, hold this," Dave said to Mike, gesturing with his head. Mike held the board. "No, not like that," Dave said gruffly. "Hold it steady. There, now hand me the hammer." They worked together. They were not friends. They were not even close. But they were a team. They fixed the ladder. They cleared the platform. They hauled up the broken boards. With a shared bucket of water, they scrubbed the word "cowards" off the wall until their arms ached. They worked through the hottest part of the day, fueled by a new, shared purpose. By late afternoon, the fortress was whole again. It was ugly. It was scarred, patched, and crooked, but it was strong. The three of them collapsed at the base of the tree, exhausted, sweaty, and still flecked with drying red mud. They shared the last of the water from Diana's jar. Apollo, his muddy adventure over, was asleep in the shade, his paws twitching. "Your brother, Pete," Mike said, his voice quiet, forcing himself to say it. "Is he?" Dave stared at the fortress. "He's okay," he said, his voice low. "Got 12 stitches. Dad's mad 'cause he has to stay inside, but he's okay." "Oh," Mike said, that's good." A comfortable silence fell. The war was over. The peace, like the fortress, was ugly and patched together. But it was real. The last weeks of August arrived, and with them, a change. The suffocating wet wool blanket of heat that had held Red Clay Creek captive finally began to lift. A breeze, the first in what felt like a lifetime, stirred the pines. The sun, no longer a white-hot eye, now cast a softer, golden light in the long afternoons. The relentless, screaming drone of the cicadas had quieted, replaced by the gentler, rhythmic chirping of evening crickets. The war was over. The summer was fading. The fortress on the oak tree was the new center of the neighborhood. It was no longer a fortress. It was just the treehouse. It was an ugly, wonderful thing. It was a patchwork of salvaged wood, crooked rungs and scarred boards, a visible testament to the battle it had endured. But it was strong, and it was shared. On a warm Saturday, Mike was up there, his legs dangling over the edge, reading a comic book. Across from him, his back against the trunk, sat Dave Wilson. Dave was whittling a piece of pine, his knife moving with a slow, practiced skill. They weren't friends, not really. There was still a wary, masculine silence between them. But it was a comfortable silence. On the ground below, Diana was showing Pete Wilson, whose leg was now a road map of angry pink scars, how to track ants back to their hill. The truce, brokered by mud and exhaustion, had held. A new sound had entered the rhythm of the strange household. It was not the crack of thunder or the roar of an angry truck. It was the long, mournful sound of the 5 o'clock whistle from the county sawmill, echoing across the valley. Just after, Stuart Strange would walk up the dirt road. He had a job. John Wilson, in a gruff, unspoken apology, had put in a word for him. Stuart now spent his days in the loud, dusty air, stacking lumber. It was hard physical work. It left his muscles aching and his hands rough with splinters. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He walked up the path, his work boots covered in sawdust, not red clay. He was tired, but it was a clean kind of tired. It was the fatigue of labor, not of the soul. His eyes were no longer vacant. They were just weary from a long day. Patricia was waiting for him on the porch. The deep lines of exhaustion that had been etched around her eyes all summer had softened. She smiled when she saw him. He climbed the steps and she met him, putting a hand on his chest and giving him a simple, quiet kiss. "How was it?" she asked. "Loud," Stuart said, and a small smile touched his own lips. "But we got that big order of 2x4s finished." He went inside to wash, the sounds of him splashing water on his face a normal, domestic rhythm. Later, as the sun began to dip below the pine line, the whole family gathered. The final scene of the day, the one that had become their new ritual, began. They were all on the front porch. The air was soft, cooling, filled with the smell of pine and the first hints of autumn. Patricia sat in the old wooden rocker, her hands finally still in her lap, a glass of sweet tea sweating on the railing beside her. she was just watching. Mike was in the yard, his body lean and strong from a summer of hauling wood. He picked up a worn tennis ball. "Apollo, go get it!" He hurled the ball toward the tree line. Apollo, who had been a silent anchor for so long, was now simply a dog. He exploded off the porch in a joyful, scrambling burst of gray and white fur. He was pure, uncomplicated happiness, his ears back, his tail flying. He snatched the ball and trotted back, his head high, dropping it at Mike's feet with a happy, panting sound, eager for the next throw. The war was over for him, too. On the top step, Stuart sat with his back against the post. Diana was beside him, her knees drawn up, telling him about her new school schedule. "And Mr. Harrison is my history teacher, and he said our first report is on the Constitutional Convention. He sounds really strict, but Mom says he's just old-fashioned." Stuart was listening. His eyes were not distant. They were not on the tree line, not scanning for threats. They were on his daughter's face. He was hearing her words. "What kind of textbook are you using?" he asked, his voice quiet. Diana, thrilled at the question, launched into a detailed description of the book, the cover, the chapters. Stuart nodded, his gaze never leaving her. He was present. Patricia stopped rocking. She watched her husband and her daughter, and a profound, quiet peace settled over her. She moved from the rocker and sat on the step, leaning her head against Stuart's shoulder. He instinctively put his arm around her. Mike, tired of the game, collapsed onto the porch, leaning his sweaty back against his father's other side. The yard grew dim. The first fireflies began to blink in the dusk. Apollo, his game finished, trotted up the steps. He was hot, panting, and content. He pushed his way past Diana's legs and, with a heavy sigh, rested his broad, noble head on Stuart's knee. It was the same position he had taken during the storm, the same anchor he had provided during the confrontation with John Wilson. But the context was gone. This was not a desperate act of grounding. This was just love. Stuart Strange sat there, surrounded by his family, the solid weight of his son on one side, the trusting warmth of his wife on the other, the steady, panting breath of his dog on his lap. He looked up at the first stars. He knew, with a certainty that no longer terrified him, that the scars would not disappear. The jungle was still in his mind. The man who had hidden in the shed, the man who had frozen in the face of conflict, would always be a part of him. The shadows were permanent. But the porch was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. He was no longer a ghost, drifting, alone in his own home. He was a father, a husband, a man. He was anchored. Stuart's hand, steady and sure, rough with sawdust, fell onto the dog's head. He stroked the soft fur between the alert ears. "Good boy," he whispered. He felt Patricia's hand find his, her fingers lacing with his own. Stuart Strange was still a soldier. He still had his scars, but he was, at long last, home. In the quietest moments, we find the deepest truths. This story reminds us that our heaviest burdens are never carried alone, especially when we have a silent, loyal guardian by our side. Apollo's love was an anchor for Stuart, a bridge for Mike, and a lesson for all of them. If these are the kinds of stories that matter to you, we would be honored if you would join our family by subscribing. Your comments and shares help these stories find others who may need to hear them, and every like supports our channel. We truly love reading your own thoughts below. Another story is already waiting for you. Just click the video now appearing on your screen.